March 9th, 1945. Tokyo slept beneath a thin veil of fog, unaware that within hours, the sky would ignite. At 10:30 p.m., air raid sirens wailed across the city. From the east, over the black waters of Tokyo Bay, the first formations of B-29 Superfortresses emerged, hundreds of them flying low, engines humming in unison. The hum grew into a thunder. Then came the sound no one would ever forget, the hollow whistle of falling canisters. Moments later, the night exploded into light. Tens of thousands of M69 incendiary bombs burst open, releasing a rain of napalm and white-hot fire. Wooden homes ignited instantly. The wind carried the flames from one district to another until the city itself became a single, roaring firestorm. Inside an underground command post, Japanese officers watched the city map turn red, their communications breaking down one by one. Every attempt to coordinate defenses vanished under the roar of wind and flame. By dawn, Tokyo was unrecognizable. Over 100,000 people lay dead, 1 million homeless, and entire neighborhoods erased. Yet, as smoke rose into the morning sky, Japan's commanders didn't yet realize this was only the beginning. The air raid had ended, but the fire never stopped. By late 1944, the war in the Pacific had shifted completely against Japan. What had once been an empire stretching across East Asia and the Pacific was collapsing piece by piece under the weight of Allied advance. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the pride of the empire, was crippled, its carriers sunk, its submarines hunted. On land, Japanese forces were being pushed back in Burma, the Philippines, and New Guinea. And yet, in Tokyo, inside the heavily fortified halls of the Imperial General Headquarters, the leadership refused to acknowledge the inevitable. Japan's military command believed that surrender was a fate worse than death. Honor, tradition, and the Bushido Code dictated that resistance must continue, no matter the cost. Civilians were being trained to fight with bamboo spears. Propaganda promised that the divine wind would protect the homeland once more. But what awaited them was not divine intervention. It was modern industrial warfare on a scale no nation had ever endured. By the summer of 1944, American airfields were established across the Pacific, stretching closer and closer to Japan's mainland. The capture of Saipan in July 1944 changed everything. For the first time, B-29 Superfortresses could reach Tokyo directly. These aircraft were unlike anything the Japanese had faced before. Massive, four-engine bombers capable of flying at 30,000 feet, far above most anti-aircraft fire, carrying up to 20,000 pounds of bombs. The Americans now had the means to bring the war directly to Japan's cities. Initially, the U.S. Army Air Forces attempted precision bombing, high-altitude strikes on factories and military facilities. But Japan's unpredictable winds, heavy cloud cover, and the inaccuracy of bombing at such heights rendered the results disappointing. Bombs often missed their targets by miles, scattering across empty fields and suburban areas. American commanders needed a new strategy, one that would break Japan's capacity to fight and, perhaps more importantly, its will to continue. That's when General Curtis LeMay entered the picture. A man known for his cold, mechanical logic and ruthless efficiency, LeMay believed that Japan's vulnerability lay not in its few factories, but in its cities themselves. Japan's industry was scattered, often hidden in small workshops embedded within wooden neighborhoods. Destroy the neighborhoods, and the war machine would die with them. It was a grim equation, but LeMay didn't see it as cruelty. He saw it as efficiency. By November 1944, the first B-29 raids began under Operation Meetinghouse, the campaign to burn Japan's war industry to the ground. From the newly captured Mariana Islands, formations of bombers lifted off daily. Each mission was an engineering marvel. Thousands of miles round trip, guided by radar, fueled by precision logistics. But for the Japanese people below, these flights meant something else entirely. A terror that could come without warning at any hour. Entire cities began to practice nightly blackouts. Students dug fire breaks. Women and children filled sandbags. The air raid shelters, shallow, hastily dug, offered little protection. Japanese air defenses were already in decline. Radar coverage was limited. Fuel shortages kept fighter planes grounded, and anti-aircraft ammunition was running low. The few interceptors that took off often climbed too slowly, or too late to reach the bombers. What Japan once considered an impenetrable homeland was now exposed. Still, the Japanese command refused to change its doctrine. They saw the air raids as temporary, a punishment to be endured until some miraculous turning point arrived. But the turning point never came. By early 1945, the United States had gained complete air superiority over the Pacific. The Navy's carrier groups dominated the seas. American submarines choked Japan's supply routes, cutting off vital oil shipments. Cities were running out of fuel, out of food, out of hope. And yet, the orders from the top remained the same. Defend to the last man. The Allied leadership saw this refusal to surrender as a green light to escalate. The plan was now simple. Bring the war to the Japanese home islands with such ferocity that surrender would be the only possible outcome. This would not be the kind of war Japan had fought in China or the Pacific. It would be fought not with soldiers, but with fire, steel, and relentless skies. In early 1945, General LeMay began to reimagine air warfare itself. He proposed something radical: abandon the high-altitude precision strikes and drop the bombs from low altitude, in waves, across entire cities. Replace explosive bombs with incendiaries. Turn Japan's wooden cities into tinderboxes. It was a plan born from cold calculation, and it would soon transform Tokyo into a sea of flame. The flames that began over the capital would soon spread across the entire nation, and Japan's commanders, still clinging to honor, would watch helplessly as their empire burned. By February 1945, Japan was surrounded. The U.S. had taken Iwo Jima, a barren volcanic island halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo. It was a strategic jewel, close enough to allow fighter escorts and emergency landing fields for the B-29s. From this point onward, the bombing of Japan could continue without pause. But before the final phase began, the man in charge, General Curtis LeMay, made a chilling assessment. He reviewed the results of months of precision bombing, thousands of sorties, enormous fuel expenditures, and yet Japan's war production still limped forward. The reality was simple. Japan's dispersed home-based factories couldn't be destroyed by high-altitude attacks. They had to be burned out, street by street. LeMay scrapped the old rules of engagement. He ordered his crews to strip their bombers of heavy defensive guns, fly lower to save fuel, and load them entirely with incendiaries. It was a daring, even reckless, decision. The B-29 was designed for high-altitude flight, but LeMay believed that surprise and volume would outweigh risk. The weapon chosen was the M69 incendiary cluster bomb, each carrying a napalm-like gel that burned at over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. These clusters would burst open in midair, scattering dozens of smaller bomblets that clung to roofs and walls, setting entire blocks ablaze in seconds. In testing, these weapons had consumed mock Japanese neighborhoods built in the Nevada desert. Now, they would be unleashed on the real thing. Japanese intelligence knew an attack was coming, but the scale and method were unimaginable. Tokyo's defenses were a fraction of what they once were. The country's best pilots were already dead, lost over the Pacific or in kamikaze missions. The fuel shortage was catastrophic. Aircraft remained grounded, rusting in hangars. Radar stations, once vital to early warnings, were unreliable. Anti-aircraft guns were low on ammunition. Inside Tokyo, the government still tried to maintain order. Civil defense organizations instructed families to store buckets of water and sand. Neighborhoods trained nightly for fire suppression drills, forming human chains to fight flames. But deep down, they knew that no amount of sand could stop a storm of fire from the sky. In March 1945, LeMay's plan was finalized. The first target? Tokyo, the largest and most densely populated city in the world. A metropolis of nearly 7 million people, most living in wooden homes. The operation would involve 334 B-29 bombers, departing from the Marianas in carefully timed waves. They would fly at just 5,000 to 7,000 feet, low enough to evade radar and maximize accuracy. but high enough to avoid the rising inferno. To the Japanese, the very idea of a low-altitude night raid over their capital seemed absurd. They assumed no pilot would risk it. But that assumption would soon be buried beneath layers of smoke and ash. As preparations unfolded, the Americans knew exactly what they were about to unleash. Many bomber crews felt uneasy. Burning a city, not a factory, went against everything they had been trained for. Yet the orders were clear. This was the fastest way to end the war. Every day Japan fought on, thousands more died in China, the Philippines, and the Pacific. The logic was brutal, but it was war stripped of illusions. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, civilians were desperate. Food shortages were severe. Rice was rationed, water unreliable. The black market thrived, and rumors spread faster than official news. Few dared to speak of surrender. Instead, the radio preached unity and faith in the emperor's divine protection. The American strategy now had a name: urban annihilation. Tokyo was first, but it would not be last. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, each marked on maps back in Guam as targets for systematic destruction. LeMay's headquarters became the nerve center of a machine that would soon turn Japan into a landscape of smoke. The raid on Tokyo would serve as a test, not of weapons, but of will. Could fire itself break an empire that refused to kneel? When the bombers took off into the Pacific night, few could imagine the scale of what was coming. The roar of their engines faded into the darkness, carrying with it not just bombs, but a message that from this night onward, the air war over Japan would never again pause. By dawn, the world would understand what LeMay's men meant when they said, "The final air raid never stopped." On the ground, the air war wasn't fought by soldiers. It was endured by civilians. Tokyo, in early March 1945, was still a living city. Children walked to school in uniform. Women carried water from public pumps. Trains rattled through the city, though often late or halted by shortages. The war felt distant to many, until the first waves of B-29s appeared over the horizon. When the incendiaries began to fall, there was no time for thought. Fire spread faster than people could run. Streets turned into rivers of flame. The oxygen itself sucked from the air. The wooden homes, built close together, filled with paper walls and tatami mats, ignited like dry leaves. Survivors later recalled that the heat melted asphalt beneath their feet. The firestorm created hurricane-force winds, dragging people into the flames. Water reservoirs boiled. Mothers threw children into rivers to save them from burning, only to see them swept away by the current. In bunkers beneath the city, civil defense units sent frantic reports. Entire districts aflame. Unable to control fire, communications down. Within 2 hours, Tokyo's firefighting network collapsed entirely. By midnight, half the city was gone. To the civilians, this was no longer war. It was apocalypse. Yet even amid the destruction, there was a grim kind of order. Families who could not flee gathered in open spaces, bowing in prayer toward the imperial palace. Soldiers patrolled the ruins, shouting orders lost in the roar of wind. Above them, the B-29 crews could see the firestorm from 150 miles away. The orange glow lit the clouds, turning the night sky into a flickering ocean of light. For many, the sight would stay with them forever, both a victory and a horror. That night, more people died in Tokyo than in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And for those who survived, the realization dawned slowly. This was only one city. Others would burn next. From a tactical perspective, the March 9th raid was a breakthrough and a turning point in air warfare. Before Tokyo, the U.S. Air Force had struggled to make bombing effective against Japan's scattered industries. LeMay's low-altitude approach flipped that logic entirely. The B-29s took off in waves from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, the newly built island fortresses of American air power. Each bomber was stripped of heavy guns to carry more fuel and incendiaries. They flew in darkness, guided by radar and celestial navigation. Their altitude, just 5,000 to 7,000 feet, was dangerously low, leaving them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. But Japanese defenses had withered to almost nothing. Radar detection was delayed. Many searchlights never switched on due to power failures. The bombers followed precise patterns, entering from the east, turning over Tokyo Bay, and laying down their fire in overlapping grids. The goal was not to destroy a single target, but to create a self-sustaining firestorm. Once the flames began, they fed themselves, expanding outward until oxygen vanished and the city suffocated. By dawn, LeMay's gamble had succeeded. His tactics had done more damage in one night than months of high-altitude bombing. The mission proved that area bombing, the systematic destruction of entire urban zones, could cripple a nation faster than traditional warfare.
After Tokyo, the U.S. would replicate the pattern over dozens of cities. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama. The B-29 became the symbol of unstoppable destruction, a weapon of both strategy and terror. Each sortie refined the technique. Meteorologists predicted wind speed and humidity. Pathfinders marked entry routes. Pilots learned how to ride the turbulence of the firestorms below. The bombing campaign had become an industrial process, efficient, repeatable, and devastating. For Japan's defenders, it was chaos. Their anti-aircraft shells burst blindly in the night sky. Fighter squadrons took off too late or ran out of fuel before finding the enemy. Each failed interception was another blow to morale. The skies that once belonged to the emperor now belonged to the enemy. The new tactics were merciless, but they were also precise in purpose. LeMay wasn't targeting civilians by name, he was targeting the infrastructure of a nation built inside cities. In practice, there was no difference. The line between military and civilian had burned away, just like the streets of Tokyo. The B-29 Superfortress was not just another bomber, it was a technological leap forward, the most advanced aircraft of the war. Its pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and massive range made it the ultimate instrument for strategic bombing. Each B-29 cost more than a modern fighter squadron. It could fly thousands of miles, carry the heaviest payloads, and return without refueling. It was powered by 4 Wright R-3350 engines, each capable of pushing the aircraft beyond 350 miles per hour, a speed unreachable by most Japanese interceptors. Inside, the crew of 11 worked in tight coordination: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, gunners. Missions lasted up to 15 hours. Fatigue, freezing temperatures, and oxygen deprivation were constant companions. Many crews never returned, lost to engine fires, turbulence, or enemy fire. The technology aboard the B-29 represented the future of warfare: distance, automation, and precision guided by science. Yet its most defining feature wasn't its engineering, it was what it carried. The bomb bays that once dropped napalm over Tokyo would later release something even more terrible: the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. To the Japanese people below, the B-29 was the sound of despair. To the Americans who built it, it was the key to ending the war. And to the world that watched from afar, it was the moment when war left the battlefield and came home. As Tokyo's embers cooled, General LeMay was already planning the next raids. He would not stop until every city that fueled Japan's war machine was burned to ash. And for the men in Tokyo's command bunkers, exhausted, sleepless, and stunned, it became clear that what they had seen that night was not the climax. It was the beginning of something worse. Inside the U.S. command structure, General Curtis LeMay embodied the cold, brutal logic of total war. He was not a man of rhetoric, but of results. His philosophy was simple: the faster the enemy breaks, the fewer lives are lost overall. He believed that by bringing Japan to its knees through overwhelming firepower, he would shorten the war and save millions, on both sides. LeMay's peers called him iron-hearted. To his crews, he was both feared and respected. He demanded precision, discipline, and an unflinching acceptance of consequences. When he briefed his men for the Tokyo raid, he made no attempt to disguise the nature of their mission: we're going to burn down Tokyo. In Japan, the leadership's mindset was tragically opposite. The Imperial General Headquarters, still dominated by the army, refused to consider surrender under any condition that might threaten the emperor's divine status. Generals and ministers argued not about how to end the war, but how to prolong it honorably. The war minister, Korechika Anami, insisted that Japan could still defend its homeland. Plans were drawn for a nationwide resistance, every civilian would fight, every street would become a battlefield. Even as reports from burned cities poured in, command meetings were filled with defiance. Better to die than yield. The gap between military pride and civilian suffering grew into a chasm. While Tokyo's survivors searched for water among the ruins, Japan's war cabinet debated strategy. No one dared tell the emperor the full extent of destruction. Information was filtered, casualty numbers softened. In contrast, LeMay's strategy became increasingly methodical. Within days of Tokyo, he expanded the target list: Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. He established rotating attack schedules to maintain psychological pressure, ensuring there would never be a day or night when Japan could rest. Each success hardened his belief in the campaign. In private, LeMay later admitted that had the Allies lost the war, he might have been tried as a war criminal. But at the time, in his mind, victory justified every flame. Leadership, on both sides, had made its choice, one guided by reason, the other by honor. Both would lead to devastation. For Japanese fighter pilots, the home defense in 1945 was an exercise in futility. The Imperial Japanese Air Force, once proud and feared, was now a ghost of its former self. The elite aces who had dominated the skies in 1941 were dead or grounded. The remaining pilots were young, poorly trained, and flying obsolete aircraft. As the B-29s approached Japan, radar stations struggled to detect them. Radio communication was unreliable, and coordination between units often broke down. When interceptors finally took off, the American bombers were already overhead, blanketing cities in fire. Pilots who did make contact faced near impossible odds. The B-29s flew higher and faster than most Japanese fighters could reach. Even if they managed to climb to interception altitude, their ammunition was limited, their engines overheated, and the bombers' gunners, guided by advanced computing sights, cut them down before they could close in. A Japanese pilot later recalled, "We climbed until our instruments froze. The enemy was a shadow in the stars. Then came the tracers, a storm of light. I never even saw their faces." For those operating the anti-aircraft batteries, the feeling was the same: helplessness. They fired into the smoke, guided only by sound. Ammunition was precious, and radar signals blurred by the heat. Every few minutes, another gun would fall silent, out of shells, or melted by the inferno spreading around them. Even in Tokyo's command centers, despair spread quietly. The telephones rang with reports of total collapse. Commanders shouted for updates from radar posts that no longer existed. And when the fires reached the army's own depots, the lines went dead completely. For the first time in the war, Japan's defenders faced an enemy they could not fight, not with courage, not with weapons, not even with suicide missions. The bombers kept coming, night after night. To many, it felt like the sky itself had turned against them. The morality of the firebombing campaign remains one of the most debated questions in modern warfare. At the time, Allied command justified it as a necessity, the fastest way to end a brutal war that Japan refused to conclude peacefully. They argued that every factory worker, every home industry, was part of the war machine. The Japanese government had mobilized the entire population, therefore, the population itself was a legitimate target. But the horror of the results was undeniable. Tens of thousands of civilians, many of them children, were incinerated in a single night. The scenes that followed the Tokyo raid defied description. The smell of burned flesh lingered for weeks. Rivers were clogged with bodies seeking refuge from the fire. Foreign journalists who entered Tokyo after Japan's surrender described the ruins as the world's largest graveyard. Even within the U.S. military, doubts grew. Some officers questioned whether such destruction was morally sustainable. Yet few dared to challenge LeMay's results. Each raid shortened the war, each burned city brought Japan closer to surrender. The argument of morality bowed to the arithmetic of death. For Japan's leaders, the question of morality was buried beneath the rubble. The same government that condemned the bombing of civilians had itself overseen atrocities in China, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia. The war had long since blurred any moral boundary. Now, the flames consumed what little remained of it. The firebombing campaign revealed a dark truth of industrial war: once total war begins, it consumes everything: soldiers, civilians, conscience, and mercy. From the ashes of Tokyo, both sides would draw their own lessons. For LeMay, it was proof that air power could decide wars. For Japan, it was the moment they understood that the next attack might erase the entire nation. And as cities continued to vanish under the B-29's shadow, Japan's commanders began to ask a question they had never dared before. How long can a country burn before it ceases to exist? The answer would come soon, in the form of the deadliest raids yet. By early 1945, Japan's fate was hanging by a thread. Its navy had been decimated, its industry crippled, and its skies dominated by American bombers. Yet the government refused to surrender. Emperor Hirohito remained silent, while the military leadership prepared for a desperate final defense of the homeland, an operation they called Ketsugo, the decisive battle. But before any invasion could begin, America aimed to burn Japan's will to fight. The mission to destroy Tokyo on March 9, 1945, was not the first bombing, but it was the most devastating single air raid in human history. Unlike the precision daylight raids on German factories, this was area bombing, meant to terrorize and annihilate civilian morale. General Curtis LeMay, head of the XXI Bomber Command, had made a cold calculation: Japan's wooden cities were tinderboxes. Precision bombing had failed due to high winds and clouds, but napalm, dropped at night and at low altitude, could turn cities into infernos. So he ordered the bombers stripped of their guns to carry more incendiaries. Each B-29 flew at just 5,000 to 9,000 feet, low enough to risk anti-aircraft fire, but perfect for accuracy. At first, the Japanese radar operators mistook the incoming planes for a small reconnaissance group. But then the radar screens lit up, hundreds of echoes, moving straight toward the capital. As the first wave arrived over Tokyo, they released long strips of window, metal foil chaff, to blind Japanese radar. By the time anti-aircraft gunners opened fire, the bombers had already begun dropping their loads. The first bombs fell on the Shitamachi district, a dense, working-class neighborhood filled with wooden homes and narrow lanes. Within minutes, flames spread faster than anyone could run. The napalm created a rolling wave of fire that leapt across rivers and engulfed entire blocks. People tried to flee toward the canals, only to find them boiling with heat. Those who jumped in suffocated or were cooked alive by the inferno above. Mothers clutched their children under bridges, their silhouettes burned into concrete by the heat. American pilots reported seeing a black ocean of flame. Tokyo's firestorm was so massive it created its own weather. Winds over 100 miles per hour whipped through the city, sucking oxygen from the streets, lifting debris, and even flipping over people as if they were leaves in a hurricane of fire. By midnight, smoke columns reached more than 30,000 feet, visible from over 100 miles away. Pilot Robert Beamer described the sight. The city was just gone. Nothing but fire, as far as you could see. Even from up here, you could smell it, the burning. The bombers kept coming for 3 more hours. 279 aircraft dropped 1,665 tons of incendiaries, methodically covering an area of over 16 square miles, 1/4 of the city. At 2:30 a.m., the last formation turned back toward Guam. Tokyo was burning uncontrolled. The aftermath was apocalyptic. When rescue workers entered the city at dawn, they found bodies piled in canals, melted together by the heat. The temperature in some areas had exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to fuse clay tiles and liquefy aluminum. Over 100,000 civilians died that night, more than in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. 1 million were left homeless. Yet, despite the horror, Japan's military leaders refused to admit defeat. They declared the victims sacrifices for the emperor. The message from Washington, however, was clear. If Japan would not surrender, every city would burn. And for the next 5 months, that's exactly what happened. Tokyo's firestorm was just the beginning of a systematic annihilation campaign. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of others followed. Each became another sea of fire under the relentless advance of the superfortresses. But even as Japan burned, American scientists were perfecting a weapon unlike anything seen before, one that would make napalm look like a spark in comparison. By mid-1945, Japan was a nation on the brink of collapse, its cities flattened, its people starving, and its military shattered. Yet the country's leaders clung to a single word: honor. They would rather face annihilation than surrender unconditionally. But while Japan struggled to survive the fires raining from the sky, across the Pacific, a new kind of storm was forming, one that would forever change the meaning of warfare. It was called the Manhattan Project. For years, under absolute secrecy, thousands of scientists and engineers in the United States had been working to harness the power of the atom. Their goal: build a bomb capable of ending the war in a single strike. The program cost over $2 billion, more than any single weapons project in history, and it had succeeded. By July 16, 1945, at a remote site in the New Mexico desert, the world's first nuclear device, codenamed Trinity, was detonated. The explosion lit up the night sky brighter than the sun, sending a shockwave felt 100 miles away. Watching the mushroom cloud rise, project leader J. Robert Oppenheimer whispered the words from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The test proved that America now held a weapon of unimaginable power, one that could obliterate entire cities in seconds. President Harry S. Truman, who had replaced Roosevelt after his sudden death in April, now faced a grim decision. Should he use it? On one hand, the Japanese government showed no signs of surrender, despite the devastation of Tokyo and dozens of other cities. On the other, a planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, was projected to cost up to 1 million Allied lives. Truman believed the atomic bomb could end the war without such a bloodbath. And so, on July 26, 1945, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender, or prompt and utter destruction. Tokyo refused. 10 days later, the order was given. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, a single B-29 named Enola Gay appeared in the clear morning sky above the city of Hiroshima. Inside its bomb bay rested a weapon called Little Boy. When the bomb detonated 1,900 feet above the city, Hiroshima vanished in an instant. A fireball over 4,000 degrees Celsius incinerated everything within 2 miles. The blast flattened 70% of all buildings, vaporized tens of thousands of people, and left the survivors horribly burned. Within seconds, 80,000 were dead, and by the end of the year, radiation sickness would claim tens of thousands more. Still, Japan did not surrender. 3 days later, on August 9, another B-29, Boxcar, flew toward Kakura, its primary target. Cloud cover forced the crew to divert to the secondary city, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m., they dropped Fat Man, a plutonium bomb far more powerful than the first. The explosion destroyed the Urakami Valley, killing 40,000 instantly and leaving the city a landscape of ash and twisted steel. Within 24 hours, Japan's leaders realized the impossible truth: their empire was finished. Emperor Hirohito broke centuries of tradition and spoke directly to the nation, announcing Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945. For the first time, the Japanese people heard the voice of their God Emperor. Trembling, sorrowful, and defeated, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. Should we continue to fight, it would result in the total extinction of human civilization. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, was finally over. But victory came at a cost beyond imagination. In less than 5 months, firebombs and atomic blasts had killed nearly 500,000 Japanese civilians. Entire cities had vanished from the map. And yet, for the world, it was not an ending, it was a beginning. The dawn of the atomic age had arrived, and humanity had crossed a line it could never uncross. Tokyo's firestorm had shown what industrial fire could do. Hiroshima and Nagasaki proved there was something far worse, a weapon that could end civilization itself. As the ashes settled over Japan, the world entered a new kind of war, one fought not with armies, but with the terrifying promise of mutual destruction. The war was over. The guns fell silent. Across the smoldering remains of Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki, a strange quiet filled the air, not of peace, but of shock. For the first time in modern history, a nation had been brought to its knees not by invasion, but by the sky. In the months that followed Japan's surrender, American occupation forces entered the ruins to document the devastation. What they saw defied imagination. Entire districts were reduced to ash and glass. Streets once filled with laughter were now lines of shadow burned into concrete walls, the outlines of people who had vanished in an instant. Scientists studied the effects of the firebombing and radiation. Engineers analyzed the wreckage of homes, schools, and temples. But beyond the ruins, something deeper was being measured, the cost of total war on the human spirit. For Japan, defeat was more than military. It was cultural, spiritual, existential. The proud empire that once dreamed of conquering Asia was now occupied, censored, and humbled. Yet in the ashes, something remarkable began to grow, resolve. Factories were rebuilt, streets repaved, and the people, broken but unbowed, began to rebuild their nation from nothing. Within 2 decades, Japan would rise again, not as a military power, but as a technological one. The same ingenuity that had once fueled war now powered peace, industry, and innovation. But the lessons of 1945 did not belong to Japan alone. Across the world, military strategists studied the American bombing campaign and realized what industrial warfare had become, a science of annihilation. Firebombing had blurred the line between soldier and civilian. Nuclear weapons erased it completely. The generals who once believed wars could be won by sheer force now faced a new reality. In the atomic age, there would be no victory, only survival. In the years that followed, the US and the Soviet Union would engage in a silent contest of escalation, each building arsenals capable of ending human civilization many times over. The same cities that once glowed with fire would now live under the constant shadow of it. The memory of Tokyo's burning, of a city consumed in a single night, became both a warning and a prophecy. For historians, it stands as one of the most devastating acts of war ever recorded. For survivors, it remains an unending night, one where the air itself burned, and the world seemed to end. Yet, hidden within the horror lies the most fragile truth of all, humanity's capacity to rebuild. From fire came reflection. From defeat, discipline. From destruction, rebirth. Tokyo today stands as a city of light, vibrant, orderly, and alive. Few who walk its modern streets can imagine the inferno that once consumed it. But deep within its foundations lies the memory of that night, a silent vow never to let such fire consume the world again. Because in the end, war does not end with surrender, it ends when memory becomes wisdom. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of those final air raids, not just the death they brought, but the life that followed. The final air raid never stopped. It became the spark that taught humanity the cost of its own power.